The iron is still warm from the fire. Amara is 23 years old, and she can feel the brand pressing into the flesh above her left breast, can smell her own skin burning as the letters rack sear themselves into her body forever, can hear through the roaring in her ears the screams of the other women, waiting in line behind her, women from her village, women she has known since childhood, women who were free 6 days ago and who will carry these marks until they die. She was, until the raiders came, a wife and mother in the kingdom of Dahomey, a woman who wove cloth that was traded across 3 regions, who had borne 2 children and was carrying a third, who walked through her village with the confidence of someone whose place in the world was secure. Now she stands on a beach she does not recognize, her wrists bound with rope that cuts deeper every time she moves, her body marked with the brand of the Royal African Company, her children torn from her arms 2 days ago and marched in a different direction toward a fate she cannot imagine. The brand means she has been purchased. The letters RAC mean she belongs to British traders now. The ship anchored in the harbor. She can see it from where she stands. Wooden walls rising from the water like a floating prison means she's about to leave everything she has ever known. A white man walks down the line of branded women, examining them the way her husband once examined goats at market. He stops in front of her. His eyes move over her body slowly, evaluating, calculating. He says something to the African man beside him, a translator, she realizes, someone who has learned to profit from this traffic in human beings. "This one," the white man says, and the translator renders it in a language she understands. "She is healthy, strong. She will survive the crossing." "She is with child," the translator notes. "I can see that. It does not matter. The child will be born into slavery if it survives. Another piece of property." The white man moves on to the next woman. Bring them all to the ship before sunset. The captain wants to sail with the morning tide. Amara is pulled forward by guards who do not speak her language, toward boats that will carry her to the ship, toward a journey across water so vast that the stories about it seem impossible. She has heard those stories. Everyone in the kingdoms near the coast has heard them. Ships that carry people away, across an ocean that takes weeks to cross, to lands where white men put Africans to work until they die. Ships where terrible things happen, things that the survivors do not speak of directly, things that leave marks deeper than the brands burned into flesh. She is about to learn what those stories left out. She is about to experience what the British slave traders did to African women every night at sea. What you are about to learn has been systematically minimized by historians who preferred to discuss the slave trade in terms of economics and mortality statistics. We know about the Middle Passage. We know about the ships, the conditions, the death rates that made the Atlantic crossing one of the deadliest journeys in human history. We know that millions of Africans were transported in chains, that hundreds of thousands died before reaching their destinations, that the survivors carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. But we do not talk about what happened to the women. The ships that crossed the Atlantic carried both men and women, though men typically outnumbered women by 2 to 1 or more. The men were kept below decks, chained in holds so cramped that they could barely move, packed together in conditions that bred disease and death. The women were kept separately. The women were kept on deck, or in areas accessible to the crew. The women were kept where the sailors could reach them. Tonight, you will learn what that accessibility meant. You will learn about the nightly rituals that occurred on British slave ships, rituals that the captains recorded in their logs with euphemisms and code words, rituals that the sailors discussed openly among themselves, rituals that transformed the Middle Passage into something even worse than the horror of chains and disease and death. You will learn about Amara, who was 23 years old when she was branded on a beach and loaded onto a ship called the Henrietta Marie, who was carrying a child she would never be permitted to raise, who discovered during 7 weeks at sea exactly what British slave traders did to African women. Subscribe if you want to understand the full horror of the Middle Passage. Comment below, telling me where you are watching from. Because Amara is about to board that ship, and I'm going to tell you what happened once the anchor was raised, what the history books minimize, what the economic analyses ignore, what Britain has never fully acknowledged about the trade that built its empire. But I need to warn you about something first. This history is not comfortable. It is not distant. It is not something that happened to abstract statistics. It happened to real women. Women with names and families and futures that were stolen from them. Women who experienced what I am about to describe and who, if they survived, carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. I am going to tell you the truth about the Middle Passage. I am going to tell you what happened to women like Amara. I am going to make you understand why this history matters. And I am going to do it because the women who experienced this deserve to have their stories told accurately, even when accuracy is painful. Let us begin. The boats carried 47 women from the beach to the ship. Amara counted them, as they were loaded, a habit of mind, perhaps, from her years of keeping track of the cloth she wove and traded. 47 women, ranging in age from perhaps 18 to perhaps 40, taken from villages across the region during the raiding season that the Europeans called the trade. Some of the women she knew. Chiamaka had been her neighbor, a woman whose laughter could be heard 3 houses away, whose skill with palm wine was famous throughout the village. Adaiz was the daughter of the chief's second wife, a young woman who had been promised in marriage to a warrior from a neighboring kingdom. Neka was older, a widow who had survived 2 husbands, and who had the look of someone who intended to survive whatever came next. Others were strangers, women from other villages, other kingdoms, other language groups. They could not all communicate with each other. They shared only the experience of capture, the brand on their flesh, the terror of what was coming. The ship grew larger as the boats approached. Amara could see its name painted on the hull, Henrietta Marie, and the British flag flying from its mast. She could see sailors moving on the deck, preparing for the cargo that was approaching. She could smell something coming from the ship, a smell she would later learn to identify as the accumulated filth of human bodies, confined in spaces too small for survival. The boats reached the ship. Ropes were lowered. The women were pulled up one by one, hauled onto the deck like sacks of grain, deposited in a group near the ship's main mast. Amara looked around, trying to understand the space she had entered. The deck was larger than she had expected, perhaps 60 feet long, crowded with equipment and supplies she did not recognize. Hatches in the deck led to spaces below, and from those spaces she could hear sounds that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The clanking of chains, the groaning of men packed together in darkness, the occasional scream that was quickly silenced. The men were below, hundreds of them. She would later learn over 300 men chained in a hold that was never meant to hold so many, lying in spaces so narrow that they could not turn over, breathing air so foul that some of them died simply from the act of breathing. But the women were not taken below. The women were kept on deck. A sailor approached the group, a large man with arms covered in tattoos, and a face that showed no particular cruelty, but no particular kindness either. He spoke to the translator who had accompanied the women from the beach. "The captain wants to inspect them before we sail. Line them up." The women were arranged in a row along the deck. Some of them tried to resist. They were struck until they complied. Some of them tried to speak. They were silenced. They stood in the line, 47 women from different villages and kingdoms, united only by their captivity and their terror. A door opened at the rear of the ship, and a man emerged who carried himself differently than the sailors. He was perhaps 50 years old, wearing clothes that marked him as someone of authority, walking with the confidence of someone who commanded this floating world. Captain James Morrison of the Henrietta Marie. He walked down the line of women slowly, examining each one in turn. His eyes moved over their bodies with the attention of a merchant assessing inventory. Occasionally he stopped, touched a woman's arm or shoulder, checked her teeth, or felt the muscles of her back. When he reached Amara, he paused longer than he had with the others. "This one is with child," he observed. "Yes, Captain," the translator confirmed. The factor noted it, but decided she was healthy enough for the crossing. How far along? Perhaps 4 or 5 months by the look of her. Morrison considered this. She may deliver during the voyage. That complicates matters. He continued his examination, his hands moving over her body in ways that made her skin crawl. But she is strong, good muscle tone, clear eyes. She will survive if anyone does. He moved on to the next woman, completing his inspection of all 47. When he was finished, he addressed the translator. "Tell them what they need to understand. They will be fed twice daily. They will be permitted on deck for exercise when weather allows. They will not attempt to escape, to harm themselves, or to interfere with the operation of this ship." He paused. "And they will cooperate with whatever is required of them. Those who cooperate will be treated reasonably. Those who resist will learn why resistance is unwise." The translator rendered the speech. Some of the women wept. Some stared blankly, not fully understanding what they were being told. Some, including Neka, the older widow, listened with expressions that suggested they understood perfectly and were already calculating how to survive. "One more thing," Morrison added. "The women will be divided into groups. Some will sleep here on deck, in the area prepared for them. Others—" He pointed to several women, apparently selected for reasons known only to him. "Others will be assigned to crew quarters. The first mate will explain their duties." The women he had pointed to included the youngest and most attractive of the group. They did not include Amara, not yet. But she saw how the selected women were led away, saw the expressions on the sailors' faces as they watched, saw the older women in the group exchange glances that communicated understanding without words. She was beginning to understand what whatever is required of them actually meant. Let me stop here to explain something about how British slave ships actually operated, because without understanding the system, you cannot understand what Amara was navigating. The Middle Passage. The journey from Africa to the Americas typically lasted between 6 and 12 weeks, depending on weather and the specific route taken. During this time, the ship was a self-contained world, governed by its captain and crew, operating under rules that existed nowhere else. The primary cargo was human beings Africans captured or purchased along the coast, loaded onto ships in numbers that guaranteed high mortality. A ship like the Henrietta Marie, which was typical of the period, might carry 300 to 400 captives, in spaces designed for far fewer. The men were packed into holds below deck, chained together in rows, given barely enough room to lie flat. The death rate in these holds was catastrophic disease. Suffocation, despair claimed victims constantly. But the women were treated differently. Slave ship captains had discovered that keeping women on deck, rather than in the holds, improved their survival rates. Women who could breathe fresh air, who could move occasionally, who were not packed into the disease-ridden darkness below these women, were more likely to survive the crossing and bring higher prices at auction. This was the official reason for keeping women on deck. The unofficial reason was access. Sailors on slave ships were typically the lowest class of maritime workers, men who could not find employment on legitimate merchant vessels, men who had been pressed into service, men whose moral boundaries had eroded through years of participating in the trade. These men spent weeks at sea, far from any oversight, surrounded by captive women who had no power to refuse them and no recourse if they were mistreated. The captains knew what happened. Most of them permitted it either because they participated themselves, because they saw it as a way to keep their crews satisfied, or because they simply did not care what happened to cargo that would be sold regardless of condition. Some captains regulated the access, assigning specific women to specific crew members, creating systems that imposed order on what would otherwise be chaos. Some captains reserved certain women for themselves, treating them as personal property for the duration of the voyage. Some captains looked away entirely, allowing their crews to do whatever they wished. The records that survive ship's logs, insurance documents, testimony from the rare legal proceedings that occurred describe what happened in euphemisms. The women were made available to the crew. The sailors took their customary liberties. The female cargo was used according to the usual practice. The euphemisms concealed a reality that the British maritime industry knew about, profited from, and never seriously attempted to stop. Every night, on ships crossing the Atlantic, British sailors visited the areas where African women were kept. Every night, those women experienced what the logs called customary liberties. Every night, for weeks that stretched into months, the Middle Passage inflicted on African women something beyond the chains and the disease and the death. This was the system that Amara had entered. This was what awaited her on the Henrietta Marie. The first night at sea, Amara learned how the system worked. The women had been divided into groups, as Captain Morrison had ordered. The largest group, about 30 women, including Amara, slept on deck in an area near the ship's bow, sheltered somewhat by canvas rigging, but exposed to wind and spray. They were given thin blankets, barely adequate for the cool ocean nights, and chained by their ankles to rings set into the deck, long enough chains to allow movement, but short enough to prevent escape. The smaller group, the women Morrison had selected during his inspection, had been taken to crew quarters somewhere in the ship's interior. Amara had not seen them since. As darkness fell, the ship's routine shifted. The day crew finished their duties. The night watch took their positions. Lanterns were lit at key points along the deck, and the sailors began to move toward the women's area. They came in ones and twos, emerging from hatches and doorways, walking with the casual confidence of men who knew they had permission for what they were about to do. Some carried cups of rum. Some carried nothing at all. All of them looked at the chained women with expressions that Amara would see again and again over the weeks that followed. The first sailor to reach the women's area was young, perhaps 25, with red hair and freckles that made him look almost boyish. He walked along the row of chained women, examining them by lantern light, before stopping in front of a woman Amara did not know. "You," he said, "come with me." The woman did not speak English. She did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture, the hand reaching down, the tug on her chain, the expectation that she would rise and follow. She resisted. What happened next was brief and brutal. The sailor struck her once, twice, hard enough to knock her to the deck. Then he unchained her ankle, grabbed her arm, and dragged her toward a sheltered corner of the ship where the lantern light did not reach. Amara heard what happened in that corner. Every woman on the deck heard it. The sounds carried clearly in the night air. The struggle, the impact of flesh against flesh. Other sounds that communicated without words exactly what was being done. When the sailor returned the woman to her place, perhaps 30 minutes later, she was not struggling anymore. She lay where he dropped her eyes staring at nothing, her body present, but her spirit somewhere else entirely. The sailor moved on to another woman. Other sailors were making similar selections. The night became a rotation of approaching figures, of women being taken and returned, of sounds that filled the darkness. Amara was not selected that first night. She did not know why. Perhaps her pregnancy made her less desirable. Perhaps chance simply passed her over. Perhaps some other factor she could not identify. But she witnessed everything. She saw what happened to the women around her. She understood what the system was. And she understood that her exemption, if it was an exemption, would not last. The woman who had been taken first, her name, Amara learned later, was Afua, did not speak for 3 days after that night. She ate when food was provided. She moved when movement was required. But she did not speak. did not respond when others addressed her, did not seem to register anything happening around her. She had gone somewhere inside herself, to a place where what had been done to her could not reach. Amara recognized the response. She had seen it before, in her village, in women who had experienced traumas too great to process. Some of them eventually returned to themselves. Some of them never did. On the fourth day, Efua spoke. How do we survive this? The question was addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone, to any woman who might have an answer. Amara was closest, and she responded. We survive by surviving. 1 night at a time, 1 hour at a time, whatever it takes to see the next sunrise. They will come again tonight. Yes, they will keep coming, every night, until we reach wherever they are taking us. Yes. Efua was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more focused. Then I need to learn how to endure it. I need to understand how this works. How to make it... She stopped, searching for words. How to make it survivable. It was not the response Amara had expected. She had expected continued silence, or perhaps despair, or perhaps the complete withdrawal that some women never recovered from. Instead, Efua was analyzing, strategizing, looking for ways to navigate a situation that seemed to offer no navigation. There is a woman, Amara said. Older, her name is Neka. She has been watching, learning, talking to the women who speak her language. She seems to understand things. Take me to her. They found Neka in her usual spot near the water barrel, a location she had claimed early and defended through force of personality. The older woman looked at them with the evaluating expression that seemed to be her permanent state. You want to know how to survive, she said to Efua. It was not a question. Yes, I cannot teach you how to survive what they do, that you must find within yourself, but I can teach you how to manage it, how to reduce the damage, how to create small protections within this unprotectable situation. Teach me. Neka looked at Amara. You too. The men have left you alone so far, I think, because of the child you carry, but that will not last. Eventually, one of them will decide that your condition does not matter. You need to be prepared. I am listening. What Neka taught them over the following hours was the accumulated wisdom of survival wisdom, gathered from conversations with other women, from observations of the ship's routines, from the hard-won knowledge of people who had no power except the power to endure. She taught them about the sailors, which ones were most dangerous, and which ones were merely following the customs of the ship, which ones could be managed through compliance, and which ones enjoyed resistance enough to make compliance worthless, which ones came once and were satisfied, and which ones returned again and again to the same woman. She taught them about timing. The sailors typically came during the early evening, after dinner, but before the serious drinking began. By late night, most of them were too drunk to be interested. If a woman could avoid selection during the early hours by appearing sick, by positioning herself near women who were more likely to be chosen, by any available strategy she might escape a particular night entirely. She taught them about aftermath, how to clean themselves with the salt water that was available, how to treat injuries using methods passed down through generations of women helping women, how to maintain the physical health that might determine whether they survived the voyage. And she taught them about the mind. What they do to your body cannot be prevented, Neka said, but what happens in your mind that you can control. You can go somewhere else. You can separate yourself from what is happening. You can preserve a part of yourself that they cannot touch. How? Different women find different ways. Some pray. Some remember their homes, their families, the lives they had before. Some count heartbeats, breaths, the number of stars visible through the rigging. The method does not matter. What matters is finding something that takes you away from the moment, that creates distance between you and what is being done. And this works? It helps. It does not eliminate the experience, but it makes the experience survivable. The women who cannot find this distance, they are the ones who break, who stop eating, who throw themselves into the sea when the opportunity arises. The women who survive are the women who learn to go somewhere else. Amara absorbed this. It was not comfort. Comfort was not available on this ship. But it was strategy. It was preparation. It was the beginning of understanding how to navigate what could not be escaped. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me. Thank me when we reach land. Thank me when you survive." Neka's voice softened slightly. "We are all we have on this ship. The men below deck cannot help us. They are fighting their own battles against chains and darkness. The sailors who take us at night see us as property, as entertainment, as things to be used. But we can help each other. We can share what we learn. We can make survival more possible. You have done this before." It was Afua who spoke. "You know too much for this to be your first time." Neka was quiet for a long moment. When she answered, her voice carried the weight of experience that Amara had only begun to imagine. "I survived a raid 15 years ago. I was taken, held for 3 months, then rescued when my family paid for my return. What happened during those 3 months taught me things that I never wanted to learn. I hoped I would never need that knowledge again." She paused. "I was wrong, and now I am sharing what I know because knowledge is the only weapon we have." The days developed a routine that Amara came to understand intimately. Morning began with the distribution of food, a paste made from ground beans and palm oil, served in wooden bowls that the women were expected to share. The food was barely adequate, designed to keep them alive rather than healthy, but eating it was essential. The women who stopped eating were the women who died. After the morning meal, the women were permitted a period of movement walking the deck, stretching muscles cramped from sleeping in chains. This exercise period was supervised by sailors who watched with expressions that reminded everyone of their vulnerability, but the movement itself was genuine. Captain Morrison had learned that cargo which could move sold for higher prices than cargo which had stiffened in chains. Midday brought another meal, similar to the first, and then the long afternoon hours when the tropical sun beat down and the women sought whatever shade they could find. During these hours, the sailors were occupied with the work of sailing. There was less attention on the women, less immediate danger of selection. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere changed. The sailors finished their daily duties. The evening meal was served to the crew, not to the captives, who had already received their rations. Rum was distributed. Conversations grew louder, laughter harsher, and the eyes that watched the women became more focused, more anticipatory. The night watch began, and the selections began with it. Amara observed the patterns over the first week, learning what Neka had taught her to see. The most dangerous time was the first 2 hours after sunset. This was when the sailors were sober enough to act, but intoxicated enough to have lost whatever restraints they possessed during daylight. During these hours, the selections happened rapidly, sometimes 5 or 6 women taken within the first hour. The safest positions were at the edges of the women's area near the bow, where the spray made sleeping uncomfortable, or near the hatch covers, where the proximity to working equipment made access awkward. Women who secured these positions were less likely to be selected. Women in the center, easily visible and easily accessible, were taken most frequently. Some sailors had preferences. The red-haired man who had taken Afua on the first night preferred women. Who resisted, he sought them out specifically, seemed to enjoy the struggle that preceded what he did. Other sailors preferred compliance. They selected women who would not fight, who would make the experience quick and uncomplicated. Learning these preferences, and positioning oneself accordingly, could make the difference between being selected and being passed over. And some women were taken by the officers. Captain Morrison himself maintained a woman in his cabin, one of the younger women from the group selected on the first day. She slept in his quarters, ate his food, was exempt from the attentions of the common sailors. In exchange, she belonged to him exclusively, was available whenever he wished, existed as his personal property for the duration of the voyage. The first mate had a similar arrangement. So did the ship's doctor, and the second mate, and the quartermaster. The officers had claimed the most desirable women, establishing a hierarchy of exploitation that mirrored the hierarchy of the ship itself. The remaining women, the 30 who slept on deck, who were available to the common sailors, learned to navigate this system as best they could. They learned when to be visible and when to hide. They learned when to comply quickly in hopes of ending the experience sooner, and when compliance would only encourage extended attention. They learned how to support each other through the nights, how to care for the injured and traumatized, how to maintain some thread of human connection in conditions designed to destroy humanity. Amara learned all of this. She watched. She listened. She prepared herself for the night when her exemption, whatever its source, would end. That night came in the second week. The sailor who selected her was not one she had identified as particularly dangerous. He was middle-aged, quiet, had a reputation among the crew as reliable rather than vicious. When he walked toward her in the gathering darkness, she felt fear. There was no avoiding fear, but not the paralyzing terror that some of the more brutal sailors inspired. "You," he said, gesturing for her to rise. She rose. She did not resist. She had learned from watching others that resistance with this particular man led to nothing except extended violence. He led her to a corner of the deck that she had seen used before, a space between cargo containers that offered minimal privacy but was apparently sufficient for the purposes at hand. He positioned her as he wanted. He began to do what he had come to do. And Amara went somewhere else. She thought about her village, the house she had shared with her husband. The 2 children who had been torn from her arms, where were they now? On another ship, sold to different buyers, already dead? She did not know. She might never know. But she could remember them. She could hold their faces in her mind while her body experienced what this man was doing to it. She thought about the cloth she used to weave, the patterns that had been passed down through her family for generations, the colors she achieved by soaking threads in different dyes for different lengths of time, the satisfaction of completing a piece that others would value and trade for. She thought about her mother, who had died when Amara was 18, who had taught her everything she knew about weaving, about cooking, about being a woman in a world that gave women few choices, who had told her once that the strongest people were not those who never suffered, but those who suffered and continued anyway. She thought about anything except what was happening to her body. It worked. Not completely, she was still aware, still felt what was being done, still experienced the violation that no mental distance could entirely eliminate. But she was not fully present. Part of her was somewhere else, somewhere this sailor could not reach, somewhere that remained her own. When it was over, it did not take long, perhaps 15 minutes, the sailor returned her to her place among the other women. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her as he walked away. She was cargo that he had used, nothing more. She lay in her spot, feeling the ache in her body, feeling the evidence of what had happened, feeling the tears that she had not permitted herself to shed finally escaping down her face. Chiamaka, her neighbor from the village, the woman whose laughter had once carried through the streets, moved closer. She said nothing. She simply placed her hand on Amara's arm and held it there, a human connection in conditions that were designed to break all connection. They stayed like that until morning. Let me tell you now about something that the historical records document clearly, but that the textbooks rarely emphasize: the role that African women played in helping each other survive the Middle Passage. The slave ships were designed to isolate captives. The men were chained below deck, unable to communicate with each other effectively, unable to organize any form of collective action. The women on deck had more freedom of movement, but they were from different ethnic groups, spoke different languages, had no common identity that might unite them. The system was supposed to prevent solidarity. It was supposed to keep each captive alone, vulnerable, unable to find strength in others. It did not work as well as the slavers hoped. Despite the language barriers, despite the tribal differences, despite the trauma that made communication difficult, the women found ways to help each other. They shared food when rations were inadequate. They cared for the sick when disease swept through the ship. They comforted each other after the nightly violations. They passed information and strategies and survival techniques across whatever barriers separated them. On the Henrietta Marie, this network formed quickly. Nika was its center, the older woman whose experience gave her knowledge that others needed, whose strength of personality allowed her to organize and direct without formal authority. But the network extended beyond her. Women who spoke the same languages translated for those who did not. Women who had particular skills, knowledge of healing plants, ability to read the sailors' moods, talent for finding hidden spaces, contributed what they could. The network could not prevent what happened at night. It could not stop the sailors from coming, could not protect any individual woman from selection, could not change the fundamental reality of captivity and exploitation, but it could make survival more possible. It could ensure that no woman was entirely alone in her suffering. It could maintain connections that the system was designed to destroy. Amara became part of this network. She contributed what she could, her ability to count and track patterns, her observations about which sailors were most dangerous, at which times, her steadiness in crisis that allowed her to help others even when she herself was struggling. And she received what the network provided: support, information, the knowledge that she was not isolated in her suffering. This network is documented in the historical record. Sailors' logs mention women who seemed to communicate despite language barriers. Ship doctors noted that women who were part of social groups had higher survival rates than women who remained isolated. Insurance reports, assessing the condition of cargo at journey's end, observed that women who arrived in networks fared better than women who arrived alone. The slavers did not understand what they were seeing. They noted it without comprehending it. But the women understood. They had discovered that connection was survival, that helping each other was helping themselves, that the system which tried to make them things could be resisted by insisting on remaining people, people who cared for each other, who supported each other, who refused to let the isolation become complete. This was the hidden story of the Middle Passage. Not just the horror, though the horror was real and must be acknowledged, but also the resilience, the creativity, the determination to maintain humanity in conditions designed to destroy it. Amara was part of this story. The network she joined would help keep her alive through the weeks that followed. The 5th week at sea brought a crisis that tested everything the women had learned. Disease had been spreading through the ship since the 3rd week, a flux that began in the men's hold and gradually reached the women on deck. The symptoms were brutal: fever, vomiting, the rapid loss of fluids that could kill within days. The ship's doctor did what he could, but his remedies were inadequate, and his attention was focused primarily on preserving the most valuable cargo. Chiamaka was one of the first women to fall ill. The fever began suddenly. One evening, she was functioning normally. The next morning, she could not rise from her spot on the deck. Her skin was hot to the touch. Her eyes were glassy. She moaned softly, continuously, a sound that communicated suffering beyond words. Amara stayed with her. She bathed Chiamaka's forehead with seawater, tried to get her to drink the small amounts of fresh water they were allotted, held her hand through the worst of the cramping and vomiting. The sailors noticed the illness. Their response was not sympathy. "If she's going to die, throw her over now," one of them said. "No point wasting food and water on cargo that won't sell." "She might recover," another countered. "Some of them do." "She won't. Look at her. She's got the death look already." Amara understood most of this conversation. She had learned enough English over the weeks to follow the sailor's speech. She understood that they were discussing whether to kill Chiamaka now or let her die naturally. She placed herself between Chiamaka and the sailors. "She will live," she said in the broken English she had acquired. "I will make her live." The sailors looked surprised both that she had spoken and that she had contradicted them. For a long moment, Amara thought they might strike her, might punish her insolence, might throw both of them overboard simply to assert their authority. Instead, one of them laughed. "The cargo is talking back. Listen to that." He turned to his companion. "All right, let her try. If the sick one isn't better in 3 days, we dump her. No point feeding something that's going to die anyway." They walked away, leaving Amara with a deadline she had no way to meet. 3 days. Chiamaka needed to recover enough in 3 days to be worth keeping alive. The network mobilized. Ineka knew traditional treatments for flux knowledge passed down through generations in her village. She directed Amara in preparing what remedies were possible with the limited materials available. Other women contributed their water rations, understanding that Chiamaka needed fluids desperately. Some women knew prayers or songs that might not heal but might provide comfort. They offered these through the long hours of the night. It was not medicine in any scientific sense. It was care intensive, focused, collective care provided by women who had nothing except each other. The first day, Chiamaka seemed to worsen. The fever climbed. The vomiting continued. She became delirious, speaking to people who were not present, crying out for her children and her mother, and the home she would never see again. The second day, something shifted. The fever broke around noon suddenly, dramatically, like a storm passing. Chiamaka opened her eyes and looked at Amara with something approaching recognition. "Am I dead?" she whispered. "Not yet. Not if I can prevent it. I dreamed I was home. I dreamed this was all a nightmare, and I would wake up and everything would be normal. I know. I have had the same dreams. But I woke up here." "Yes, but you woke up. That is what matters. You woke up, and you will keep waking up, and eventually this voyage will end, and we will find a way to survive whatever comes next." The third day, when the sailors came to check whether their cargo was worth keeping, Chiamaka was sitting up. She was weak, desperately weak, barely able to support her own weight, but she was alive. She was conscious. She was, in the brutal calculus of the slave trade, still worth preserving. "Well," the sailor said, looking at her with something that might have been surprise, "the cargo recovered. Who would have thought?" They walked away. Chiamaka was permitted to live. It was a small victory. One woman's survival among hundreds who did not survive, who died of disease or despair, or the accumulated trauma of the voyage. But it was a victory nonetheless, proof that the network could accomplish something, that collective care could make a difference, that the system's power was not absolute. Amara held Chiamaka's hand as she slept that night, protecting her from sailors who might have selected a woman too weak to resist. She had saved one person. In the mathematics of the Middle Passage, that was an achievement beyond measure. The voyage lasted 47 days. 47 days from the coast of Africa to the island of Jamaica, where the Henrietta Marie would deliver its surviving cargo to the slave markets of the Caribbean. 47 days of disease and death, of nightly visitations, of the slow, grinding horror that the Middle Passage inflicted on everyone who experienced it. Amara counted the deaths. It was the same habit that had led her to count the women when they boarded a way of imposing order on chaos, of maintaining some connection to reality. 14 women died during the crossing, some from disease, some from despair. Women who stopped eating, stopped responding, simply stopped until their bodies followed where their spirits had already gone. One threw herself into the sea during a rare moment of reduced supervision. Her body disappeared beneath the waves before anyone could react. From the men's hold below decks, the numbers were worse. Amara could not count those deaths directly, but she heard the bodies being brought up and thrown overboard. She heard the splashes, day after day, that marked the end of lives that had been captured to serve British economic interests. The sailors estimated that perhaps 70 men died during the crossing. Perhaps more, the records were not precise, and the bodies were disposed of quickly to prevent disease from spreading. When the Henrietta Marie finally sighted land, the green hills of Jamaica rising from the horizon, the survivors numbered roughly 250. 250 people out of more than 350 who had boarded, a loss rate of approximately 30%, considered acceptable by the standards of the trade. Acceptable. The death of 1 in 3 human beings was acceptable because the profits from the survivors still exceeded the costs of the voyage. This was the calculation that drove the Middle Passage. This was the mathematics of human suffering that built British wealth. But I am getting ahead of the story. Before the arrival, before the slave markets of Jamaica, there is one more night at sea that I need to tell you about. The night before landfall, the women knew the voyage was ending. They could see the change in the sailors' behavior, the increased energy, the anticipation of shore leave and payment, the subtle shift in attention away from the cargo and toward what awaited them on land. The women also knew what landfall meant for them. Sale, separation, the beginning of lives in slavery that might be better or worse than what they had experienced on the ship. The uncertainty was almost as terrible as the certainty of the voyage itself. That final night, the network gathered. They could not all be in one place. The sailors would have noticed and suspected conspiracy. But they gathered in small groups, exchanging words across the darkness, maintaining the connections that had kept them alive. Nneka spoke first, her voice carrying to those nearby, her words passed along to those beyond hearing range. Tomorrow we will be separated, sold to different buyers, sent to different places. We may never see each other again. We may never know who survives and who does not. Silence. The weight of this truth settling over women who had become, in some sense, family. But we have survived this voyage. We have helped each other survive it. We have proven that they cannot destroy what we are not completely. Not the part of us that cares for each other, that supports each other, that refuses to become the things they see us as. What happens now? Someone asked. What do we do when we are alone? You will not be alone. Wherever you go, there will be other women who have experienced what you have experienced. Women who survived other ships, other voyages, other horrors. Find them. Connect with them. Build networks like the one we built here. That is how we survive. Not alone, never alone. Together, even when together means something different than it means tonight. And if we cannot find others, if we are isolated, kept from connecting, then remember what you learned here. Remember that you survived the Middle Passage. Remember that you are stronger than you knew, more resilient than they expected, more determined than they can comprehend. Remember that survival itself is resistance, that every day you continue to live is a day they have not destroyed you. Amara listened, absorbing the words, knowing that she would carry them into whatever came next. She touched her belly, where the child she carried had somehow survived the voyage. She did not know how the pregnancy had persisted through disease and deprivation, through the physical trauma of what the sailors had done, through 7 weeks of conditions designed to kill. But the child was still there, still growing, still alive. The child would be born into slavery. The child would never know freedom, would never see Africa, would grow up as property in a world that saw them as property. But the child would also carry something from this voyage, the strength that had allowed Amara to survive, the strategies she had learned, the connections that had sustained her. The child would be part of a network that began on this ship, but would extend across generations, across oceans, across the centuries that separated the Middle Passage from the world that would eventually emerge from its horrors. Amara did not know any of this that night. She knew only that she had survived, that she would continue to survive, that survival was the only victory available, and she intended to claim it. The sun rose over Jamaica. The Henrietta Marie dropped anchor in Kingston Harbor. The next chapter of Amara's life was about to begin. What happened after the voyage deserves its own telling, but I will give you the outline. Amara was sold at auction in Kingston, purchased by a sugar plantation owner who valued her apparent health in her pregnancy. A pregnant woman was 2 pieces of property for the price of 1. She was taken to a plantation in the island's interior, put to work in the fields alongside hundreds of other enslaved Africans. She gave birth 3 months later. A daughter. The plantation owner recorded the birth in his ledger, another piece of property added to his inventory, another human being reduced to a line in an accounting book. Amara named the child Adaora. It meant daughter of all, a name that acknowledged the collective survival that had made the birth possible. The network of women who had helped Amara through the voyage and who continued to help her in the new horrors of plantation life. She never saw Chiamaka again. The woman she had saved from being thrown overboard was sold to a different buyer, taken to a different plantation, lost in the vast machinery of Caribbean slavery. But Amara heard, years later, that a woman matching Chiamaka's description had survived into old age on an estate near Montego Bay. She hoped it was true. Nneka was purchased by a household in Kingston itself, domestic slavery rather than field work, a fate considered more fortunate, though still brutal in its own ways. She continued to build networks, to share knowledge, to help other women survive. She became known among the enslaved population of Kingston as someone who understood things, who could help with problems, who maintained connections across plantations and generations. The network that had formed on the Henrietta Marie dispersed but did not disappear. The women who survived carried its knowledge into their new lives, taught it to other enslaved people, built new networks on the foundation of what they had learned. Survival strategies passed from person to person, plantation to plantation, generation to generation. This was the hidden legacy of the Middle Passage. Not just the horror, though the horror was real and lasting, but also the resilience that emerged from it, the determination to survive, the networks of mutual support that made survival possible, the refusal to become the things that the slavers tried to make them. Amara lived for 37 more years after her arrival in Jamaica. She never returned to Africa. She never saw her husband or her first 2 children again. She spent her entire remaining life as property, subject to the whims of owners who saw her as an investment rather than a person. But she survived. She raised Adaora and 2 more children born in slavery. She taught them what she knew, the survival strategies, the network building, the determination to maintain humanity in conditions designed to destroy it. She became part of the collective memory of the enslaved population, her story passed down even when her name was forgotten. When she died sometime around 1793, though the records are not precise, she had outlived the Henrietta Marie itself. The ship had sunk off the coast of Florida in 1697, its cargo of trade goods lost to the sea, its crew drowned in waters that would eventually reveal the wreck to modern archaeologists. The ship was gone. But what had happened on it, what British slave traders had done to African women every night at sea, lived on in the memories of survivors and the descendants they raised to remember. What you have learned tonight is the truth that Britain preferred to forget. The slave trade was not simply an economic system. It was not simply a matter of transporting human beings from one place to another. It was a comprehensive horror that included, as one of its essential elements, the systematic exploitation of African women by British sailors during the weeks of the Middle Passage. Every ship that crossed the Atlantic carried this horror. Every voyage included nights when sailors visited the women's areas, when the customary liberties described in euphemistic logs were exercised against women who had no power to refuse. Every survivor who reached the Americas carried memories of what had been done during the crossing. This was known. It was documented. It was discussed openly among the merchants and captains who profited from the trade, and then it was forgotten. Not accidentally forgotten, deliberately forgotten. Erased from the histories that celebrated British maritime achievement, minimized in the accounts that acknowledged slavery's cruelty but focused on other aspects, reduced to statistics and euphemisms that concealed the specific gendered violence that was integral to the system. The ship's logs still exist. The insurance documents, the plantation records, the rare testimonies of survivors, these sources are available to historians who wish to examine them. The evidence is clear for anyone willing to see it. But seeing it requires acknowledging something that Britain has never fully acknowledged, that the wealth which built the empire included wealth generated by the systematic exploitation of African women. That the sugar in British tea, the cotton in British clothes, the prosperity that funded British culture, all of this rested on a foundation that included what happened on ships like the Henrietta Marie every night at sea. Remember Amara. Remember the 23-year-old woman who was branded on a beach and loaded onto a ship, who was carrying a child she would never be free to raise, who learned during 47 days at sea exactly what the Middle Passage involved. Remember that she survived, that she found ways to survive, strategies to endure, networks of support that made endurance possible, that she carried her survival into a new life of slavery and taught what she knew to others. Remember that her story is not unique, that millions of women experienced versions of what she experienced, that the Middle Passage was not one horror, but many, and that among those horrors, the nightly exploitation of women was constant, documented, and never adequately addressed by the nation that profited from it. The wreck of the Henrietta Marie was discovered in 1972 off the coast of Key West, Florida. Archaeologists found the ship's bell, which confirmed its identity. They found shackles, iron restraints, designed to hold human beings in bondage. They found trade goods that had been destined for African markets, payment for the human cargo that the ship transported. They found evidence of a system that had operated for centuries, that had transported millions of people, that had generated enormous wealth for Britain and devastating loss for Africa. What they could not find in the wreck was evidence of what had happened to the women. The nightly violations left no archaeological trace. The trauma that survivors carried, the memories that shaped generations, did not preserve itself in the ocean floor. The specific horror that I have described tonight exists only in documents, testimonies, the historical record that requires interpretation rather than excavation. But the absence of physical evidence does not mean the absence of truth. We know what happened. We know because the sailors wrote about it, because the captains logged it, because the survivors testified when given the opportunity, because the patterns are consistent across hundreds of voyages documented over centuries. We know, and we must remember. The Henrietta Marie is now commemorated by a monument. Off the coast of Key West, beneath the waters where the ship sank, a concrete marker was placed in 1993. The inscription reads, "Henrietta Marie, in memory and recognition of the courage, pain, and suffering of enslaved African people, speak her name and gently touch the souls of our ancestors." The monument does not mention what happened to the women. Perhaps there are no words that could adequately capture it. Perhaps the horror is too great for concrete and inscription. Perhaps the commemoration of the voyage must include, in its silence, an acknowledgement of things too terrible to write on monuments. But I have spoken the words tonight. I have told you what British slave traders did to African women every night at sea. I have given you Amara's story, one woman's story, standing for millions who experienced similar fates. Remember her. Remember the brand on her chest, the ship that carried her, the 47 nights of the Middle Passage. Remember the network of women who helped each other survive. Remember Chiamaka, saved from being thrown overboard by collective care. Remember Neka, whose wisdom guided others through the horror. Remember Adaora, born into slavery but carrying the strength of her mother's survival. Remember that this history is not distant, that its consequences shaped the world we inhabit, that Britain's wealth, America's foundations, the entire structure of Atlantic civilization rests on what happened in the holds and on the decks of ships like the Henrietta Marie. Remember, because remembering is the beginning of understanding, and understanding is the beginning of ensuring that such horrors are never permitted again. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand the slave trade without understanding what happened to the women. Remember the Middle Passage. Remember the women. Remember Amara. Remember,